The topic for tonight's discussion meet is listed in your program and reads, as the voice of agriculture, how can Farm Bureau be more inclusive of all agriculture and production practices? This includes, but is not limited to, women in agriculture, organic production, fresh produce, forestry, and aquaculture. During the 30-minute conversation, the contestants will each be graded on their problem-solving ability, delivery, analysis of the topic, cooperative attitude, and their opening and closing statements. Our timekeeper for this evening is Ms. Sarah Burnett, a member of the State Young Farmer Advisory Committee from Pulaski County. Let me now introduce tonight's contestants. Mackenzie Wright, representing Carroll County. Mike Meyer from Harrison County. Lily Robertson, representing Logan County. And Brian Welsh from Hopkins County. We will begin the contest with a 30-second opening statement and by each contestant in voluntary order. We will follow with 30 minutes of open discussion of the topic. I will alert everyone when there are 5 minutes remaining. Following our discussion, I will ask for 1 minute of quiet time for each contestant to gather their thoughts and prepare their closing remarks. After that, we will have the contestants' 1-minute closing statements, again in voluntary order. Before we begin, let me restate tonight's topic. As the voice of agriculture, how can Farm Bureau be more inclusive of all agriculture and production practices? This includes, but is not limited to, women in agriculture, organic production, fresh produce, forestry, and aquaculture. I will now open the floor for the contestants by asking that each contestant stand and, in voluntary order, give their 30-second opening statement.
Apiculture, viticulture, horticulture, aquaculture. All are a component of agriculture. But do we always show a culture of inclusion and acceptance? Kentucky Farm Bureau works hard to be the voice of all agriculture, from the forests of eastern Kentucky to the small vineyards back home. These unique production practices are a key component to making Kentucky agriculture unique and diverse.
Why Kentucky Farm Bureau? Why now? The UK College of Agriculture statistics tell us that current enrollment is 68% female. Governor's Office of Ag Policy mentions that 15% of our work sector is agriculture and 1.2% is production. We must make sure that if Farm Bureau is going to be the voice of agriculture for another 100 years, and that we have one unified voice to society, and that is when we include every minority, women, young farmers, small and large primary commodity business. This is an educated group. We'll have a great discussion.
Diversity provides the framework needed to generate new ideas. But without the genuine appreciation of these unique individuals, authentic inclusion cannot occur. While Farm Bureau does a great job at recognizing these unique groups through programs such as the Roadside Farmers Market and through policies that Farm Bureau endorses, is there more that we can do to allow for agricultural inclusion within our organization over the next 100 years? I look forward to discussing this topic with you all tonight.
Minorities in agriculture used to be a niche, but look and ask around the room and I'm sure you'll discover the growing trend of non-traditional farm practices and people. The USDA has identified unique and distinct issues that women and ethnic minorities in agriculture face. Additionally, non-traditional practices such as aquaculture and organic produce have really found a home in our Commonwealth. I look forward to discussing with the group how we can address these issues and let Farm Bureau be the voice of these non-traditional for many years to come.
You may now begin with your discussion.
Brian, you said something that I really like. Diversity equals new ideas. And I think that we've all brought up different ways that Kentucky Farm Bureau includes different groups to lead and to stand out. Another thing that you mentioned was the roadside farmers markets, and I think that's a great opportunity for those fresh produce outlets, but also the face of Farm Bureau to be present in our communities and to be very active as well. Mike, I know you guys have a very active community of lots of variety down there. Do you all have an active farmers market, roadside market kind of deal there?
Yes, Mackenzie, good thing you brought that up, because first, before I answer that question, I want to make sure that we're all, and it sounds like we are from our opening statements, on the same page about what perspective Farm Bureau has, and that is it's the voice of agriculture. So trying to make sure that it sustains that and continues to be that for another 100 years, I think is something that certainly you all have brought up a lot of good options that we will get to address, especially those small niche business practices, and that's super important. I feel like in Harrison County, our board, we're super fortunate. I just looked at a few statistics, Mackenzie, the other day of Harrison County. We are 17% men, 16% women, 17 men, 16 women, and 10 young farmers on our board. And that includes a rabbit, a poultry producer, somebody with hemp, a disability. And so we are super diverse. And it got me kind of thinking a little bit of our area and our district. And so I did a little bit of research because I wanted to see what the makeup of those were. And in the last 2 months, I interviewed 16 counties. Men, women, young farmers, women's chairs, presidents, and statistics that I gathered were just staggering. 76% were men, 24% were women, and 11% of those out of those 16 counties in the central Kentucky area were young farmers. And that was just super staggering and eye-opening to me to think that. And if you take 2 counties out of that group, that drops down to 78% men, 21% women, and 8% young farmers. And to me, that's where we have got to improve. We have to look on the county level, and you all have talked about that, not only representing those small niche groups in those markets, but do we have the diversity? And that's different, Brian, for every single group. I know I didn't even think in Hopkins County how you guys have coal. And I didn't even think about that in the South. So, Brian, do you feel like that on your Farm Bureau board that you have representation for coal in, I believe, 3 farmers markets out of the 160 in the state? Do you feel like you represent that voice there?
I think that there's a lot of voice that's given in Hopkins County, especially when you look at the diversity of it. And we go a lot further than just what coal is as well, because that's still a big thing, I think, across a lot of the parts of our state. But I think we also need to focus on what the question's really asking. It's not just about diversity, but it's about inclusion. And I think that over the years, we've thrown out all those words and we've wanted to incorporate those within all of the organizations that maybe we represent. We haven't maybe really solidified what the definitions of those are. And so it would be, in my opinion, similar to having a barbecue and inviting a vegetarian out there. But then once that vegetarian gets there, the only thing they can eat is the corn on the cob. Yes, I have the diversity there, but I don't have that true, genuine sense of inclusion. And so kind of moving us forward, I know you brought up a lot of fantastic points about the statistics and about what it looks like diversity-wise. And so I think a big step for us to now start thinking about is maybe why is it important for us to have that diversity? Why is it important for us to have that inclusion? And then next, how do we get that? And so, Lily, what do you think?
Well, Brian, I really like what you said about making people feel included. And, you know, the big thing is really making those non-traditional people feel at home here in Kentucky Farm Bureau. And I think one of the ways that Farm Bureau has started to do that, and I think will continue as well, is through the young farmer outings. And, you know, we've seen a lot of non-traditional farms and different practices, and those operated by just a huge variety of people through our Commonwealth. And I think when people get to go on those tours, I know I've visited hemp farms and sorghum farms all throughout the state, and that makes those people feel really included. You know, they're welcome and they're at home, and they get to learn about practices that relate more to their farm than perhaps a grain farm would, you know. And so I think that what I would like to know, what kind of conferences could Kentucky Farm Bureau put on, maybe on the local level? What could our local farm bureaus do to really make those people in our counties feel home and welcome within our, you know, monthly meetings, but also additional things that we put on to let them know that we really welcome them and that their contribution to agriculture is important.
I think you bring up a great point about how do we include them in conferences and events that make them not necessarily feel like they have to present at a meeting or something like that. I read up on Mississippi's Farm Bureau, and they actually did a project specifically to increase the opportunities for honeybee farmers to feel as a part of their farmers market groups, but also as a part of their Farm Bureau. And so they literally put them all down at a table with farmers, and they said, let's develop what they called the Honeybee Stewardship program. And they worked with farmers, and they said, hey, here's a GPS map of our community. This is where the hives are. We all know the huge importance right now of pollinators and the collapse of colonies and things like that going on. And Mississippi Farm Bureau did a great job of, you know, saying, hey, this is an issue in our state. We need these things. How can can we get everybody at the table? They developed these really cool flags that were a simple design that the farmers allowed for the honeybee operators to put on their hives that was shown clearly from the road. They educated the farmers about things like that, and they just got them all at the table. And so I think something that Kentucky Farm Bureau does, and we need to work better at, is, when we meet, we eat. How can we bring those groups to the table and make sure that they really feel like they have a seat with us there, and that they're not just there to be there as a token vegetarian at our meal, but truly a part of that? And so, maybe it's we look at state board seats or director seats or committees that we want to establish in our communities and things like that would help us to expand those options.
And Mackenzie, you bring up a good point, because the thing is, I feel like there's a lot of strength already there with Farm Bureau. On the state level, there's 27 different or more plus advisory committees that cover a lot of these smaller groups, and young farmers conferences and summer outing and women's conference and the newly developed women's boot camp, which just started this past year. I think part of it goes back to where our biggest benefit in Farm Bureau is that we have a marketing presence in every county in Kentucky, and that's our boards. And when we go back and look at that, somehow we're not quite getting the transition, or what we would see is that diversity on our board. And diversity is two ways, pretty much in agriculture. One, are we diverse in those small business practices, like you had mentioned earlier, right in the beginning in your opening statement? And then also our personal diversity as well. And in agriculture, it more looks like not just minorities, but women and young farmers on top of that. And I would, thinking of that, how can we get those people involved, not on the county level? Because my wife tells me all the time, she thinks I'm kind of weird because I'm okay going out and eating at a restaurant by myself. But a lot of ladies are not, and some gentlemen are not as well. And is our environment in our county boards, are they open? Are they inviting for young farmers to feel welcome, and ladies right out of college, and even young gentlemen, or other people that feel like they're in a minority in a group, such as honey or bees, or as I mentioned with rabbits and poultry or hemp? Do they feel that there's an inviting, comfortable environment in our county boards, so that way when we get ready to qualify them for that young farmer and that women's outing and stuff like that, we want to take them in groups, invite them in as groups. And one of the things that I mentioned to one of the counties when I interviewed them, and I heard a really neat story, was they went, and it was the first time they were on their board as a young mom, and they took their child to the meeting with them. And in the middle, got hungry, got a little upset, just like I do, start crying when you get hungry, right? Went to the back to nurse that baby. The oldest board member at the end of that meeting came up to her afterwards and said, "Thank you for what you do, and I hope you realize the importance of what you're doing, and we're just glad you're here." And I feel like that voice is out there in every single county that I talk to. And it's just a matter of maybe they just need a little bit of help understanding how to adapt that. So Brian, how do you think is a good way that we can help our boards who have been around and have experience for so long create an inclusive environment on our board level, on the county level?
I think that is a very good point, and I think that we've kind of touched on that in quite a few spots as far as it is that local level, and I think this impact has to be made. Going to the state conferences and all of that can be a little bit overwhelming,
right,
especially like you said, just having that niche group that you might be able to fit in with. At the local level, I know that there are a lot of ways that, at least in Hopkins County, that we try to incorporate some of those diverse groups. I know over the last 2 years, we've hosted a conference called Roots to Riches, and what this does, it allows different types of farmers to come together and really learn the different processes as far as how they can get to be more financially stable, to be better at marketing their product, and a lot of different programs like that. Similar to what we have here at this conference, we have those specialty sort of sessions, right, where if I'm in the forestry, I can go to that session, I can learn more about that. Same thing can happen here that would allow those people at your local level to kind of meet, to kind of congregate, and kind of have that fellowship that you had talked about. I think you brought up a very good phrase, a very nice word choices when you said to let them have a seat at the table, because sometimes we force people to be sitting at the table and they feel super uncomfortable, which I think is kind of what you were talking about. Yeah. But I'd kind of like to see maybe what are you guys doing in your all's counties for this?
We have a particular program right now that we just started this year in our county that has made our board totally transition, and it's a co-op program with a female student that works in our office strictly for our federation, and she has done outreach in our elementary schools, and more than just agriculture lessons in our elementary schools, she has been able to be a face of our federation in those elementary schools, and it has truly transitioned our community. And no longer does our community only think of, as in most of our communities, Farm Bureau as our agency manager, which there's no fault in that, and it benefits us all for that. But we're now, Madeline has been able to step out and become truly influential in how does our county perceive our board. And, I think a lot of that plays into it. She is a female. She's young. As Mike, you've talked about the young farmer presence there. And she's trying to, just relate to them a little bit more. And so she gives a great opportunity for something that we're doing locally. I think the Roots to Riches thing is huge for us, because one of the problems is that business management for all operations. And so when we look at how do we help minorities and ethnic groups and any farmer of any level manage their business better, we're going to see more people in the business all the way around.
You know, you're exactly right. And that's one thing our board has done is by adding the FFA president of the county. We have, you know, increased the diversity, but also attracted so many young people to Farm Bureau in our county. Another thing that I'm interested in that has recently just become huge to me is first generation farmers are a minority in agriculture. And I think was displayed in the Outstanding Young Farm Family, you know, Farm Bureau is doing a great job at including those people. But I'd be interested to know how effective the Roots to Ridges program is with the first generation farmers, because that's something, you know, that's really essential to them as they, you know, learn and grow in agriculture. And additionally, how that we as maybe board members in our community or as people involved in young farmers can go reach those first generation farmers by visiting their farm and by making, you know, those home visits. And so I'd be interested to know what your all's counties do to make those first generation farmers feel really welcome in our communities.
Going back to the Roots to Riches point there, a lot of that is focused on those newer farmers, those newer producers, and like Mackenzie had talked about, those diverse farmers who maybe don't have that experience. One thing that you had talked about is we're on a board level trying to get more involvement from those diverse groups, but I think what we have to do as Farm Bureau members, being probably from more traditional sort of mindset, we have to put ourselves in their shoes, because if we don't put ourselves in their shoes, we don't really understand why they're uncomfortable there. We don't really understand what their needs are. My parents themselves are kind of in that niche market. They weren't necessarily they're first generation farmers. They're not raising cattle, they're not raising corn, they're raising dairy goats and llamas. And so talk about diversity, talk about not having any sort of resources. And whenever we look at that concept, that's the biggest thing that I think these people are striving for. And I think that's what's going to give them value to even want to be at the table with Farm Bureau, is to make sure that they have not only their voice being heard, but they also have the opportunity to get those resources maybe at these conferences or whatever else.
Well, I think one of the things that, you know, that comes to my mind is that, you know, a lot of times coming from traditional farming operations, we're raised to think that if you don't do it like I did it, or you don't do it like Granddaddy did it, it's not right. And so I think that that's changing that mindset of that it's okay to do something different than what's been done before or different than I do, but still be a part of this and to be a part of the conversation. You know, the hemp production down there in your area, Mike, are huge. And so I think that's the perception of hemp is something that we're trying to overcome as a state. And, you know, I would love to know how the marketing strategies are going to be to open up people's mind, and the perception of that, you know, is working out for your community and things like that.
It's been really inviting, and actually we have a hemp day was for the first time in our community. So, I mean, I think because of the fact that what the environment that has had on tobacco and such a reduction in tobacco farmers, like hemp has been a replacement for a lot of them. And we've tried to make sure that on our board we have a representative, and we have two currently that are raising, one that has for a year or so, and then one will be raising in 2019. And I wanted to jump and just throw something by you all to see what you thought about, maybe we could kind of bridge a gap a little bit. We've mentioned that the State Farm Bureau already has so many events that are welcoming as far as hosted by Young Farmer Committee or Women's, and then also the advisory committees. And our communities and our county boards, I think, just in Central Kentucky, what my research was just looking at was, you know, maybe we're lacking some of those women and young farmers there and the diverse groups. Somehow we can kind of bridge that gap. And I was wondering, just in mentioning with one of the women's chairs, she said that we would love to have some women and some younger farmers on there, but we just don't quite know how to make them fit. And I know a couple counties, particularly in the Central Kentucky area, that have things even such as babysitters during their meeting that come from Ag Ed Department and FFA, and they utilize those to make sure that the women and men, the moms, the dads that are young, they can come in and be professionals and be in that meeting, and that's such something that's really easy to adopt. Another thing that I thought about was, the use of Skype and Zoom as far as conferences. When you have a young husband or a young wife that can't get away from the home but still wants to be on the Farm Bureau board, they can be a part of that meeting. We just need to kind of get that connect with technology there. What is your all's thought on possibly having some type of a state farm or a Farm Bureau liaison from State Farm Bureau, some kind of a field rep, that their job is to go out and help these more experienced boards in our communities identify maybe what their limitations are, and to help them feel more comforted and see what diversity looks like on their level, because it's different for every single community. So what would be your all's thought on possibly Farm Bureau having those field liaisons, or somebody that can go out and say, here's how the technology works, how can we help you? Here, okay, you have coal in Hopkins County, you have a large number of farmers markets, you live on the Tennessee line, you live in the third smallest county in Kentucky, which has its own struggles in Carroll County. What do you all think about Farm Bureau maybe helping to provide and bridge that gap that way to get those people involved?
I I think that Farm Bureau already has a lot of resources at their advantage that they should really capitalize on instead of making extra work for that sort of benefit. Working with our extension agents, working with the agriculture teachers in the community, I think would be a fantastic way to kind of reach out to those people in the community and really maybe even work with the boards. It gives them a fresh look, gives them that fresh outlook, especially with ag teachers whenever we transition ourselves all across the state, not really from there, kind of get that opportunity to kind of give that fresh input. Kind of moving on to a different, I think we all have a very solid consensus that at the local level, with our boards and with all of that, we need to reach out to these people. But now let's maybe transition our focus on legislatively what we can do, because like the question says, we're the voice of agriculture. And so as the voice of agriculture on the state level, on a district level, on a local level, there's a lot of policies that Farm Bureau endorses. And a lot of those even have to do with alternative farming methods, with those diversity sort of looks or outlooks. And so one big piece of policy is just simply supporting the master settlement agreement and making sure that we have the money, the finances there to allow people to diversify and really increase that amount of diversity that we have within our organization. Is there any other policy or legislation that you guys think is important for us to really highlight?
Well, I know one that's really affecting Kentucky agriculture is the aquaculture. And I know aquaculture in Kentucky right now is struggling because of the lack of regulation and permitting issues, because there's not a lot of legislation regarding permitting issues. And as aquaculture has grown tremendously within our Commonwealth, that's something I know that a lot of farmers have run into. And so I think that Kentucky Farm Bureau could really, like you said, use their resources. KSU has just a wonderful aquaculture program that is just leading our part of the nation. And so by partnering with the available resources of KSU, I think that Farm Bureau could develop legislation that could help those aquaculture farmers have a set path and really make it easier for people wanting to diversify and get into the aquaculture industry as we continue along, And I think that there are many other resources. So what are some industries you see in your communities that are struggling and that need legislation to help them along?
Well, I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, and that's no secret with my accent, but when I spoke to my cousin, who is a fourth-generation sawmill operator, and one of the things that was very unique that he explained to me was if he buys two identical loaders, and one of them goes into the forest to load up the logs fresh cut, and one of them stays at the pallet mill back in Wolfe County, the one that comes to the pallet mill that handles the final product is taxed just like a regular piece of equipment, whereas the product that's in the field or in the forest is not taxed as an agriculture product. And so I was very interested in that, and I was like, that doesn't really make sense. My first question was, why didn't you just tell them they were both going to the forest? But I was like, he was like, you do what you got to do, right? And so I found it very unique that, that fine line for our producers that are handling those final products at farmers markets or those value-added products, whether it's packaged honey, or utilizing KSU's trailer to, can those jellies so that you can sell them at the farmer's market, that as soon as it touches that final product, it becomes a taxable good. And so that was something that legislatively I was like, that needs to be looked at, because those pallets that he's making there are still a huge asset to the community. They're an agriculture product still. And so, along those lines, the taxing and the legislation, the regulation and things, all that, that very well about the coal industry down there, They don't get much more regulated than that.
That's exactly right. And I think with that legislative approach, and as we kind of talked about that, you guys have brought up some really good points, and it really ties in my opinion, why inclusion is so important. We have seen so many times when agriculture has been divided. And I, this morning, flew in from Texas at a conference. And with that conference, I got to talk to a bunch of different agriculture teachers from all across the country. One of those people was from California. We've probably heard in the news as far as how California's had a lot of that legislation that has just passed that is going to be detrimental to agriculture, not only there, but also across our entire country whenever we look at poultry and we look at pork. Now, if we were to better combine our forces and really be on a united front, I think that we're not going to have as many issues with that. And it may seem like it's really far away and it's not as important, but we've seen it with dairy and we've seen it with soybeans in the last 12 months alone. And so I think that the big piece of inclusion is to make sure that not only do they feel welcome, not only do we make sure that people feel like they have a voice with agriculture, but that we can be a voice together and we can be a front for agriculture.
Right, I agree. And you bring up really good points about legislation, and then we want to make sure that we're supporting that on the state level as well as locally. I just want to make sure that we, make sure that we are establishing between us something that we can agree on a direction to move forward. When something, I know a lot of times we talk about diversity because it's tough, but then it's hard to implement meaningful action in the end, and sometimes very little gets done. And you brought some really good points out about, Brian, about supporting, making sure that we identify that legislation that's going to support that. I had a really good opportunity to talk to Janice Persons, and she's the field rep for educational diversity out of Bayer in St. Louis, and she mentioned after our conference call, she mentioned that, sometimes it's easier for an organization to address an issue when presented with the stats or the specific makeups of boards and things like that on your own terms instead of waiting until it's too late. And I feel like sometimes that, in Farm Bureau, it's important that we recognize what, our current leadership is and our local leadership and things like that, and to identify those groups because, one county president mentioned to me when speaking with them that they felt like that they just did not have a lot of young people coming back into production in their county, which kind of surprised me because it was a bigger county. And I got the wheels turning like you all were thinking. We graduate seniors out of agriculture education every single year. We move seniors on out of 4-H every single year that have some type of an interest in agriculture. Right now in the College of Agriculture, almost 90% of agriculture education majors are female. They're there. They're strong. They're motivated. They are there. They are spread all across Kentucky. And I think it's our job to just help identify where they are and to help them have a place and have a voice on our counties. And I think that's important. We go with the legislation, Brian. I think that we mentioned with you guys and just supporting those local niche type markets and fields. And can we use that? And I did want to clarify, Brian, before when I was mentioning about a field liaison or a representative, I didn't mean in terms of our current area directors. They are so busy and doing what they're doing. I'm talking about somebody that's specific job is to help boards that are maybe a little bit older generationally and need a little bit of help with technology, maybe setting up a computer system or something for Skype or Zoom. One time I had the opportunity to sit in on I'm our current Kentucky president for 4-H. And we were having a meeting, a Southern Region meeting with somebody from Florida, myself, North Carolina, Tennessee, and I'm driving on my truck, listening in on Skype, going down the road, and that's the only way that's possible. But I felt included, and I felt like my voice was being heard, even though I couldn't be on site. And something like that, I think, if a young producer is in his combine and it's the middle of the night and he wants to be there but he can't, that's a good opportunity for him to be able to do that. And I'm not saying every time, because we don't want to make it a point where we're all on the phone and having a meeting, and that's not the point. But trying to create that environment. So babysitter, as we mentioned, maybe some technology, maybe having somebody that could come out and help our counties identify, say, hey, Harrison County, here's what I think you need to make sure. Here's what diversity looks like to you. Poultry, rabbits, cattle. You have quite a bit of cattle still. You're transitioning to hemp. Do you represent those? Let's look at some options. Brian, what do you think that something down there in Hopkins County is coal? That Alliance Corporation, I saw 500 employees in your community is great. I mean, that's awesome with that new warehouse that they put in July. Do you feel like that your board has representation from that coal industry and from those smaller sectors besides just wheat and soybeans and that type of thing?
Well, I think whenever you look at the board itself, you have to go beyond just the people who come to those meetings at the end of the day, because the people who are on the board don't just need to represent those communities, but they need to have that network within those communities as well. And I know that between our agents and between our president and all those people on there, they have those strong connections, and they're willing to go out and they're willing to go out and meet with those people, which I think is important at the end of the day as well.
It's important to have a spread group,
exactly.
Like, that experience and that younger too.
And so at the same time, like we've talked a lot about the people and forcing them to go into those leadership positions. It's going to be kind of an inconvenience for some people. Not everybody is in our shoes where they're willing to put themselves out there in the way that we have. I think that we also have to remember the people like Belinda Welch, my mother, who aren't going to come to this sort of thing, that are going to have to stay home, and that are going to just want the resources at the end of the day. They don't necessarily want to have to go to a meeting. They don't want to have to go to anything else. They just need the resources so they can be more substantial. Brent Gibson is another fantastic example of that in Hopkins County. He's a first-time farmer, but he's wanting to do Christmas trees. And with this Christmas tree operation, he had a family farm. It was not being utilized, and so he started the process of planting that. He didn't do it to make money. He didn't do it for a lot of different things other than the fact that he just wanted something to have for he and his family. And so whenever I was talking with him, he really wanted, again, like my mom, those resources. And so I think that as we move forward, maybe as we transition to the next level, not necessarily just with the leadership itself on our boards, but maybe talk about where those resources can be, how we can get those resources to the people who need those resources.
Mike, talking about your field agents that you're talking about, I think you're on track there with that. We need to really look at as we've said before, who's not at the table?
Right.
What other groups are they going to because we don't make them feel included? You know, we've not mentioned a whole lot about the Amish and Mennonites communities. Those are huge farming
And it's
groups in
growing
our
everywhere.
state, and
Yeah.
they are growing.
Yeah.
And they are peaceful members of our community that tribute a lot of agriculture products to our towns. And so, you know, how do we maybe utilize technology in the form of surveys, or whether we, you know, do in our mailers that our county farm bureaus send out, you know, what kind of agriculture are you involved in? Why do you not feel like you can come to meetings? Are we leaving you out? Like, asking those questions, I think, opens us up to say, hey, maybe we aren't perfect, but I know that Farm Bureau actively tries and works hard to make sure of that. But there's, you know, as generations move along, things change. You know, we're not doing the same kind of farming as our parents or our grandparents.
5 minutes remaining.
We have to look at who's not at the table and how do we make them aware that we want them there. And I think that using that technology you talked about, you know, and Lily, you're at UK still, and the Manners group, they are very active. They were started in Kentucky, and Manners is, you know, the Minorities in Agriculture and Natural Resources group that specifically targets, you know, African Americans and different ethnic groups there. And I can remember when I came there, they tried to recruit me because I was from Eastern Kentucky and I had went to college. And so you don't think about even rural students becoming a minority. But, you know, how do you see Manners playing out in terms of, you know, the atmosphere at UK and how they feel included in the College of Agriculture there?
You know, Kinsey, I think you're exactly right. And I really like what you said about just making people feel welcome at the table. And it does start on the county level and or, you know, at the college level, because agriculture and Farm Bureau is a grassroots organization, and agriculture is a grassroots industry, really. And so it has to start at the local and county levels where people feel like that they're welcome. And I think Manners does a good job of just exemplifying what that can look like. And, you know, without Manners, the College of Ag at UK would definitely not be the same. And they contribute such a large part of the community and the diversity, but also just the ideas that you see on the board and the student council. And I think that our boards could have a lot to learn from that and to look to that. And I think that as we continue to include different groups, whether it's by practices or by ethnicity and race and gender, like you said, Mike, you know, the amount of females going to college is greatly outnumbering the males, and that's definitely evident on UK's campus. And so I'd be interested to know how you all thought that agriculture, like you said, is going to change, and it's going to change on the local level. So what change do you project in your counties, and how can Farm Bureau get ahead of that curve so that we're not sitting here saying, how can we include hemp producers now that they exist, but how can we include them before it's even happening in our counties?
Washington State Farm Bureau did a great job of that. They recognized that there was a new and growing group of vineyard operations in their community and in their state, and instead of being just a sponsor of a field day, they actually put on and hosted a field day for viticulture people that were interested and that wanted to come out and to learn more and to also get help for the existing operations. And I think that, you know, one of the things that Kentucky Farm Bureau does a really good job of and that we cannot understate is the importance of looking outward. What are other people doing that makes them feel included? And, you know, I hear all the time, you know, we don't just want to sponsor, we want to be a part of it. And so I think that model of, you know, let's look at who's not at the table and can we offer a specific conference or a field rep or educational opportunities to make them feel like, hey, we're supporting you wholeheartedly. We don't just want to throw grant money or scholarship money at you. We want you to be a part of us. And I think, you know, that talking about, you know, and looking at, you know, models like Washington State and Mississippi's stewardship program, you know, and looking at, you know, how are they testing the fields? How are they including people? Is huge how we can make sure that that happens.
And we have a local example right here in Kentucky of a Fleming County program that has a farm week that just is an extremely cool thing where they come in and have boards and discussions, and where the president of Farm Bureau was down there and being public to the community, being a voice and being an image to the community so people can put in schools with the tractor parade was huge down there. There's a lot of big support. And it's a week-long activity. They read in the schools, but it's sending a positive message out to everybody to let them know that agriculture is more than just farming. We need people in communication. We need people that are strong in marketing. We need people to put out the good voice. I read in Forbes, there was an article several years ago that said the two maybe most important venues in a successful business is one, what is your marketing face, and they have a vision for the future. And then the second part of that is can they realize the next step, kind of like the opposite of the Toys R Us or effect, where if you're not willing grown to be like a Netflix and say, let's get the movies in the home. What do we need to do? And I think Farm Bureau is excellent at marketing. Those videos that just touch on our emotions and the pictures of families and everything else, that's what it's meant to do, and it does. They're short clips, they're on social media, they know their audience, and they make it happen. And I think as long as we can continue to look on the county side and start to develop there, kind of what we mentioned, make sure that we recognize that we need to make sure that we are including both on the niche market, the primary commodities, but also those people diversities too. On each county level, we can start doing that here, and I think it will show a difference later on. And Mackenzie, you brought up a lot of good points about Manners. That's another one that we don't even think about that's Farm Bureau supported. You know, we think about the young farmer and the women's programs and things like that. Manners is supported by Farm Bureau too at UK, and that's something that you can take back in Cooperative Extension or anywhere and have a program in every single county. So that's a really good suggestion, Mackenzie. Lily, I think something that you mentioned that was pretty neat too.
Time has expired. We will now have 1 minute of quiet time. We will now ask for closing statements. Again, please stand and proceed with your closing statement in voluntary order.
I had the opportunity to hear my son yesterday make a comment on video that somebody asked him, and they wanted him to say, "I am the future of Farm Bureau." It is up to us to make that a reality. If that's going to be possible for another 100 years in Farm Bureau, we have to make certain that for my kids and those kids out there, that we have one unified voice that includes all those minority groups, that includes our small niche operations, as well as our primary production agriculture. I think the ideas that Brian and Mackenzie and Lily all mentioned up here of us being able to take and look at those diversity complexes, we can put those together. Team up with Farm Bureau to help with maybe a field representative or somebody who can help us identify each individual county possibility, what our limitations are, what are they, and how can we make that look like a better situation. Do we want to know why it's important for Farm Bureau to be inclusive? It's because the future of agriculture for my kids and those other kids on that video comes to fruition, and it exists for another 100 years to come. Thank you.
Kentucky agriculture has survived because we can transition and we can become diverse. We've seen that in the speech that Ryan Quarles gave yesterday, where he asked for tobacco farmers that had produced in their lives to raise their hand, and then he recognized those that were still in production. Just like Mike, Brian, and Lily and I have always expressed, inclusion comes from across the board and from across the state. Looking at who's not at our table and how can we make them feel welcome is how we will begin to reach those people that will continue to help our organization grow, as well as the productions that we all love and cherish.
We've had a wonderful discussion today, recognizing countless groups that have to be included at our table to ensure the success of Farm Bureau over the next 100 years. As we've discussed, Farm Bureau is a grassroots organization, and this movement's going to start in our counties. I look forward to seeing the legislation that each of you identify in your own counties to push forward, as well as how you include the different groups in both your boards and in your activities.
Working hard for something you hate is called stress. But when you work hard for something you love, it's called passion. It's evident we had a very passionate panel up here today, as we're all working hard to solve an industry that we love. When trying to figure out how do we make a more inclusive environment for the Farm Bureau family, there were some great points brought to the table. From supportive policy to diversifying our boards at the local level to educational outreaches such as Manners and all of those concepts, all linking together to provide us the passion or the direction to move forward for this organization. And so as we end with this tonight, I look forward to seeing how we can make a seat for all at the Farm Bureau family so that we can have a united front for the voice of agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, contestants, for a lively discussion. It is now my pleasure to announce the winners of the 2018 Discussion Meet Contest. The prizes for the Final Four are listed in tonight's program. At this time, I would like to ask Mr. Drew Graham, Mr. Mark Haney, and Mr. Jackson Toll to come forward, present these awards, and congratulate the winners. The two Discussion Meet finalists are Lily Robertson from Logan County and Mackenzie Wright from Carroll County. This year's state runner-up is Mike Meyer from Harrison County. And the state winner for 2018 is Brian Welsh from Hopkins County.